Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Dark Dive, the podcast that delves into the depths of the dark web. My name is Aidan Murphy, and I'm your host as each month we take a look at a different aspect of the dark web. We talk a lot on the podcast about the threats out there, on this hidden part of the internet. But one aspect we haven't covered so much is what exactly happens when those threats hit an organization. What happens when you're the victim of a cyber attack? How do companies respond on that fateful day when they realise their network has been breached? And what should they be doing beforehand to prepare themselves for that day? Joining me to discuss these questions and more is one of the leaders in the incident response world, Caleb Barlow, who led IBM X-Force, threat intelligence organisation, and is now CEO of the cyber skills development company, Cyberbit. Thanks for joining me, Caleb.
Oh, pleasure to be here, Aidan.
I'm also joined by Searchlight Cyber's own Luke Donovan, who regular listeners will remember from our episode on dark web data leaks. Luke is head of threat intelligence at Searchlight Cyber and has had his own forays into the world of incident response, helping companies cope with the fallout of cyber attacks. Hello, Luke.
Hi, Aidan. Hi, Caleb. Nice to be here today.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys. So before we kick off, I think it'd just be worthwhile giving listeners a little bit of background on each of you. So, Caleb, do you mind giving a little bit of an overview?
Yeah, sure. I think as it applies here, probably, I've had the opportunity to work at both small companies as well as a really big company at IBM, where I ran the IBM X-Force, both the threat intelligence business as well as incident response. What's kind of interesting coming out of that is it was an opportunity at the time, and this is back, it's 5-6 years ago now, where you were responding to some very large-scale breaches and very large-scale incidents that oftentimes impacted multiple companies at the same time, things like WannaCry and NotPetya. And, what was amazing to me coming out of that was you really started to realize that right of boom, companies are woefully unprepared. You would work with companies that left of boom had bought all the tools, all the capabilities, but when it actually hit the proverbial fan, executives didn't know how to make decisions. I think this really changed my career and kind of the trajectory and a lot of what we'll probably talk about here today. And I started to think about, wow, how do you not only build that muscle memory and all those capabilities left of boom, but how do you build those same capabilities so when you do end up right of boom, you dramatically reduce the risk. You can create teams that can migrate through the uncertain quicker. And that's a combination not only of skilling, but also really having access to good intelligence. Interestingly enough, that then led my career to really start to pursue this and building things like cyber ranges. I mean, we at IBM, we came up with the first really physical commercial cyber range. And the backstory on that is it 100% came out of the frustration of responding to these incidents where the lackluster response from executives would cause more damage than the threat actor. And now I run a company that's what we focus on every day. So that's me.
Brilliant, Caleb. I mean, you've already brought up a load of stuff I want to talk about, and this is why you're such a good guest for this podcast. Because, and just before I move on to Luke, so I'm going to get to you in a second, Luke, but because in my mind, X-Force and IBM, I think they're almost kind of like the pioneers in this incident response place. Is that how it felt at the time?
Well, I think, look, there are a lot of people doing incident response. I think the part that we really pioneered that no one else had touched was the concept of incident command. In that, and you have to understand, I can't remember what the percentage was, but I'm guessing it was probably like 25-30% of my team had prior military or government experience. I personally grew up in the emergency response community. I literally grew up in the back of a fire station in my younger years. And the thing is, in those types of careers where, think of physicians, think of firefighters, EMTs, military, you learn how to make decisions differently. You learn how to build run books to pre-plan for what the worst thing is that could happen. Basically, these are careers where you plan for right of boom. Those things didn't exist in corporations. And probably the most impactful event for me was WannaCry. I had 14 customers that had dropped in a matter of minutes, and I had no telemetry. and no ability to make decisions. And granted, WannaCry was over with pretty quickly. The good news is all those customers fared great. But doing the retrospective on that, we kind of sat down as a team. We're like, never again are we going to have this situation. And that led to all kinds of innovations around how to plan for things, how to build incident command systems where you could make decisions across multiple customers in a large scale incident. And I think a lot of, kind of new ideas came out of that. Now, IBM has since, largely divested of those businesses, but I do think that that's where a lot of it came from. And we now see those things replicated all over the world.
I'm just gonna put WannaCry just in case any listeners weren't in the cybersecurity industry when that happened. But Caleb, maybe you can explain, because it wasn't just IBM, right?
Oh, it was the whole industry.
Everyone was shocked by the scale of WannaCry.
We're all standing there and things are dropping like flies and nobody understands what's going on. And, it's this, and, in a lot of ways, like, you never know what novel issue is going to cause multiple systems to go down. I mean, probably the most recent example of this wasn't even a cyber attack. It was, the failed patches from CrowdStrike, right? But the reality is, was that technically a cybersecurity incident? No. Is the response absolutely identical? Yes, it is. Like, the only difference was you knew it wasn't a bad actor. It was actually a good actor that screwed up. But you still have to make decisions on a fly. You have to mitigate risks. You have to decide what you're going to do. And I think, you saw some companies fared really well with that, relatively speaking, and others failed, really had some severe failures. 100% of that comes down to your planning and exercising right a boom.
Well, and speaking of people who have a military background, so Luke, finally I'll go on to your introduction. Maybe you can give people a little bit of an overview of where you're coming from on this and your experience of incident response, which I think is a slightly different perspective to Caleb's.
It is. It's a very different perspective to Caleb's. Like Caleb and you yourself already mentioned, I come from a military background. I was in military intelligence. So I started off in 2005, and then in 2016, I then adapted my understanding of incident response, of the threat landscape and intelligence, and started working in the corporate environment. Started working with the public sector and private sector, depending on who my client was at the time. There was numerous different clients we were working with. Throughout that period of time, I've been involved in a significant number of incident responses, both from a cyber environment and also from a more kinetic environment. So I remember times of being in situations and incidents where an IED had hit a vehicle. An IED had hit a vehicle. We got a security incident there. We got to do something about that incident. As a section, if you're not trained, if you're not prepared, all hell breaks loose. You don't know what's going on. You don't know how to take command of that situation. You don't know what your next steps are going to be. You don't know how to deal with any casualties you've got. So from an incident response perspective, what we end up doing is going back to our training, going back to the plans, going back to everything we put in place, putting out cordons to contain the threat or to identify the threat, getting involved in communications, bringing in the technical expertise to help us, whether it's medical evacs, where it's explosive ordnance individuals to remove any devices, drawing all that experience together. So I went from that environment all the way across into the cyber environment, where there's a lot of similarities, where it's somebody breaching your firewalls, gaining access to your systems, looking for those indicators and warnings of threats. And so since 2016, I've been in the cyber environment. I previously worked in a smaller organization than Searchlight Cyber. And since the start of this year, I've come across Searchlight Cyber as the head of threat intelligence.
So presumably what Caleb was saying just a minute ago about a lot of people kind of pioneering the space of incident response have a kind of military or emergency services background, and the kind of experience that must completely resonate with you. That's similar to your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes down to a lot of the processes which are in place. I think if you look at the cyber processes when it comes around incident response, preparation, the identification, containment, eradication, etc. Those steps you're going to take when you're conducting an incident response in the cyber environment, exactly the same if you're in a military environment. You're still going to go through those same steps.
Okay, brilliant. With that, I'm going to go back to you, Caleb. So This is a very top level question, and I apologize because it's probably the hardest one to answer. But from your perspective, then, what are kind of the fundamental tenets of incident response? In which, I mean, if an organization is coming to this and maybe they're not massively experienced, what should they be thinking about?
Well, let's talk about this from the perspective, not so much from the actual incident responders, right? I mean, there is the incident responders are going to be going through, obviously, a very technical process. But let's talk about this from a boardroom perspective, right? I think there's a couple of really core principles that, they didn't teach you in Harvard Business School, right? Of, if you think about, your classic executive challenge of how do you solve a big problem, like, you're going to, how many times in your career have you been told, slow down, think, get more data, maybe get the opinion of others? Well, the first thing you have to recognize the minute you have an incident of magnitude, and there's a whole other step we can talk about how do you know when you have an incident of magnitude, is time is not on your side. Time is the most valuable commodity you have. So what does that mean? It means you need to make decisions fast. And you need to make decisions with limited data. There's a great quote out there that, if I can't remember what the exact numbers are, but, if you wait until you've got like 70% of the data that you need to make a decision, the decision's already made for you in the event of an incident response. So you've got to increase this pacing. I think one of the first things you've also got to recognize is you have to make decisions with the people in the room. Like, if the CEO is on a plane for the next 12 hours, then the CEO is not part of the incident response process. You've got to make sure you've got the delegated authorities to respond urgently. And look, here's the test I always give people, right? Is can you assemble the team you need to assemble at 3:00 in the morning on Christmas Eve? That's the team you're working with. So that's the team you need to practice with. Who's on that team? Who are their delegates? And how do you do that? And how do you exercise it? So that's a big part of where we need to start.
Amazing. And I'm just going to come to you, Luke. So or does it feel, I just feel on the psychology part of things, so like Caleb says, this is a stressful situation. You have to make decisions quickly. Psychologically, that must be super tough.
It's very tough. But as long as you've got the training, the background in place, and you can adapt that and improvise on that, then you're sorted for the situations. In the incident response situations I've been involved in when it comes to cyber related, end users have come to us with an issue, whether they've been hit by ransomware attack, whether it's been a DDoS attack, you name it. There's a wide variety of incidents out there. When they've come to us, it's very eye-opening how many of them are not prepared for that situation. They've come to the call, they're panicking, they don't know what to do. And as Caleb said, that's a lot of time wasted because they don't know who to reach out to. They haven't got the team in place to be reacting to that incident, which has given more time to that threat actor to go and conduct their activities. But yeah, it's that timing, that panicking. How do you prevent that?
So what I'm getting from both of you, and this is not an original thought when it comes to this response, but a lot of this comes down to preparation beforehand, right? So like you say, Caleb, you need to know who those people are going to be there at 3 a.m. And if you don't know who those people are and you don't know the lines of command and all these things, then you have a problem. So what are the best practices in terms of preparation? So, I mean, Caleb, you talked about some of the things that IBM did, kind of create cyber ranges, but presumably simulations, table talk exercises, playbooks. Is all of this part of the rich tapestry?
Well, it's all part of the rich tapestry. I think the other thing that really comes into this is you have to learn some new skills, right? So, just like there is executive decision making, there's crisis decision making. And that is a very, very different mental model of how you approach things. So, so for example, if we're teaching, I'll give you one example, right? If we're helping an executive team really understand, how is crisis decision making differently, we really spend a lot of time talking about a concept called an OODA loop. Some of your listeners are probably familiar with this. It stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. It's a methodology that was developed by a U.S. Air Force fighter pilot that was trying to articulate how do you make decisions in a dogfight. And, if we think about this overlaid to cyber, right, first thing you do is observe what has happened, how has it happened, what do you know about it? The next thing you try to do is orient yourself. Is there other information you could bring into this? Is there something unique that's happening in the environment right now? Is there something unique that's happening in the company, like maybe an acquisition? Could you get informed through threat intelligence from the dark web with tools like Searchlight, right? So you're going to really orient yourself. You're going to make a decision. on what you're going to do, and then you're going to act. But here's where this really separates from executive decision making. In a boardroom decision, you make a decision and, maybe you come back a month later to say, hey, how's it going? And there's probably a lot of resistance to changing that decision. In crisis decision making, you immediately go back to that loop and start over and reorient yourself. Did the decision work? Did anything change? And you're totally open to going back on your own decisions based on new data. So this sounds like a very simple concept. It actually takes a lot to train people to think and make decisions differently and process through these OODA loops. In the case of, kind of the example of where this came from in a dogfight, right? He who processes their OODA loop faster wins the dogfight. Well, the biggest thing I always try to ground executives on realizing is that in a cybersecurity incident, you are up against a human adversary. There is someone on the other side of the glass that is watching what you're doing, can make decisions based on your response. And until you recognize that you're up against a human adversary, your natural inclination in boardroom decision-making is to try to approach things with a formula. There's no formula or framework for this. This is much more analogous to a boxing match, and you need to be prepared for that.
Yeah, I guess that's what the OODA loop is such a great analogy because you're against another pilot, right? There's someone else you're trying to get away from them, and they're trying to get you. So that's
exactly.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way of thinking about it. And again, sorry, Caleb, I'm chucking all the hard questions at you. But how well do you think organizations are doing at kind of taking on these skills? Presumably, since your IBM days, people are much more aware of these type of methodologies than they were before. But is this still something you find
pretty lousy in general, right? I mean, look, okay, the professors at Harvard refer to cybersecurity as a novel risk, meaning that is unpredictable risk that you can't predict and you don't necessarily know how to respond to. And when they first came out with this definition, I looked at it, I said, yes, you're spot on. I'll tell you though, I think we're starting to see more of this as a hybrid risk of a lot of things that are occurring now from a cybersecurity perspective. They're not the highly sophisticated nation state adversary that everyone with some unique 0 day. 99% of what occurs is completely predictable. You got impacted by ransomware. Let me be very clear. That was 100% avoidable. So you didn't have the policies in place, the procedures in place, or the defenses in place. Getting impacted by ransomware nowadays isn't any different than your building burned down by fire. It was a predictable risk, and either you had the things in place to mitigate that, the equivalence of, the smoke detectors and fire suppression systems and sprinklers, or you didn't. And unfortunately, we've gotten so enamored by the risk and deflected by the cost of mitigating it that a lot of times we just try to punt that risk to insurance, hope it won't happen, and then we're all surprised when when one of these companies gets impacted. But the other thing we have to recognize here is that every time a company pays a ransom, you are literally the venture capitalist for the next incident that occurs. Look at the size. Do you know what $1 million buys in Moscow? You just paid for that whole team a Lamborghini, a really nice party, and everything in between, right? On one incident. And I think until people really realize that, we're not going to change the dynamics of this anytime soon.
People listening can't see this, but Luke is nodding his head and smiling, so I'm going to assume he's in agreement.
Luke's trying to think about what car he wants to buy. I think he'd win one of these ransoms.
Luke, what was your experience? How well are organizations doing?
It's pretty poor. It is pretty poor. I've dealt with multiple organizations globally when it comes to different incidents, and their understanding is lax. There's a number of different frameworks, a number of different sort of methodologies you can take to identify threats, mitigate those threats. Now, there's one called the F3EAD cycle. So where you find, fix, finish the target. Then you're going to exploit the information which you've got, and then you're going to analyze it. I'm not going to go into it in any great depth, but there's something for the listeners to go off and review. Cycles like that, cycles like the intelligence cycle, if you've got a firm understanding of them and you apply them to an incident, or even prior to an incident, you're going to be in a really good shape. It's about identifying that threat first and people just don't do it.
And do you think the reason people don't do it, do you agree with Caleb, is there this kind of reluctance to engage with the problem, I guess, is one way you could put it, or a belief that the problem is just too big and too insurmountable, that's too hard to prepare for these scenarios?
Yeah, I don't think it's too hard to prepare for these scenarios. I think a lot of it comes down to resourcing and experience within teams. A lot of these teams, they've got their work cut out. They've got a lot of pressure on them dealing with the security of organizations, that to add in additional complexity around incident response, around monitoring, say, the dark web, it just becomes a little bit too much for them.
Okay. But I think something interesting that Caleb said is that actually the novel risk element is reducing, and a lot of this is predictable. And surely some of this comes down to kind of increased access to intelligence. And maybe this is a difference. I don't know, Caleb, tell me what you think. Again, between maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago and now, the kind of access to threat intelligence that organizations have, is that likely to play a role in people improving their instant response if they do engage with it?
Well, absolutely. So think of this: 5, 6 years ago, no one cared who this, no one cared about attribution, right? It was, you got malware in your system, you need to eradicate it. It doesn't matter if it was a nation state adversary or a bored teenager. That's no longer the case. Now, first of all, it is absolutely possible in most cases to get fairly reasonable levels of attribution. You may not know the person's name, but you probably know the actor, the campaign, or the motivation. And that becomes very important because it can impact decision-making on, hey, was this an employee that clicked on a link they shouldn't have in some sort of, large-scale operation that they just got unlucky and we're going to mitigate that workstation and not worry about it? Or are we actually being targeted by a very specific actor, in which case we need to up our defenses? So I think that makes an enormous difference. But here's the other thing, right, is that threat intelligence now can help us stop something before it even gets started, right? If we see a campaign emerging, if we see that our company or one of our executives or maybe parts of our supply chain are in the target zone of the motivations of that actor or that campaign, then we can do things to mitigate that before that attack occurs. I don't usually like to use, kind of military analogies here, but this isn't any different than how a military uses intelligence, right? If you can disrupt the adversary before they attack, that's going to be a heck of a lot more fruitful than waiting until you're already a victim. And I think in the case of threat intelligence nowadays, because these threat actors are typically loosely coupled organizations of professionals that don't necessarily even know each other, they're all communicating via dark web forums and Telegram. So it is absolutely in the art of the possible to intercept your company's name, your company's logo, your executives during that initial formation of a campaign. And although we talk a lot about, we were laughing a little bit about, the level of sophistication of people to respond, the reality is the more sophisticated organizations you don't hear about, because they're either preventing these incidents before they ever occur, or they're rapidly mitigating the incident as soon as it starts to occur, because they have a very good idea of who's coming at them and what techniques they're going to use.
If I can just continue on some of those points, what Caleb just mentioned there. I dealt with a private sector organization a couple of years ago. They were hit by a DDoS attack. Okay, and they come to me and said, we've been hit by a DDoS attack. It was a fairly significant DDoS attack. Took out all their systems. They come up with a lot of analysis, a lot of assessments in terms of who they thought was behind it, the attribution aspect. Were they going to be targeted again? The organization I was doing this work for didn't have any threat intelligence in-house. Okay, this is their security teams making the assessments. So they tasked me to go off, try and identify who was behind it. I went off onto the dark web. I went off to some forums, some paste sites, etc. And through doing some analysis, through doing some searches based on their organizational name, based on some other entities, it was very, very clear who the adversary was, who was behind the attack. The attacker posted way before the attack that they were going to target the organization, how they were going to target them, and the IP addresses they were going to target. Everything was laid out there on a piece of paper for them. So if that organization had any threat intelligence in place, looking across the sources where they posted the content, they'd had this early warning that there was a threat there, and they could have done something to prevent this. Increase their resourcing, increasing their DDoS protection. But because they didn't have that in place, it eventually meant that they were hit fairly significantly.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. So I want to just kind of stick on this for a second and really drive it home, because I guess what we're talking about here, it's still within the realms of instant response. But to use a phrase that you used, Caleb, which I really liked, we're almost talking now about acting left of boom before really the real impact of the incident has taken place. As Luke was just describing, you might be being targeted in a dark web forum. They may have, already identified a way of accessing your system, but this is before that, I guess, the dreadful day where your computer screen is frozen and you've been given a ransom demand. Is that what we're saying, Luke? Is that what you're describing there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. I did just want to come back to this attribution part of things as well, which was the first point you mentioned, Caleb, because I thought that was really interesting. I've heard before people argue that it doesn't matter who's attacking you. What matters what's happening. That might be quite a controversial statement, considering what we're talking about. And I could see Luke grimacing a little bit. Is that wrong? If people are saying that, if people believe that it doesn't matter who the attackers are, have they kind of misunderstood what we're trying to do here, Caleb?
Well, I think historically it probably didn't, but here's the way to look at it. Who the attackers are probably doesn't matter a whole lot in the attack you're in right now because you're already a victim. It definitely matters a lot for the next attack and trying to prevent that.
Yeah, absolutely, Caleb. It's about identifying the intention, their capability, their tactics, their techniques, their procedures. If you can understand that, you understand how they might traverse through your system if they breach your system. And therefore, if you know how they're going to traverse through your system, you can then work out how are you going to contain that threat and then eradicate that threat.
I'll give you a perfect example, right? So real world incident. This is several years ago when EDR was still new. A Chinese adversary is all over the company's network, and we find it here, there, and everywhere. The problem is the company does not have EDR tooling, so it's difficult to figure out where the adversary is. And in this case, you knew how the adversary was coming in. So the decision is, do you close the door on the way the adversary is coming in, or do you get EDR deployed first? And the argument was, if you close the door, you stop the damage. The counter argument was not necessarily, because you don't know if they've established any other backdoors, which they probably have, and that adversary can then immediately pivot and jog. So the decision was made to just close the door. And then they started a slow rollout of EDR. Well, guess what they found? Which was, as they started a slow rollout of EDR, they found the adversary was all over a whole bunch of other stuff, right? But that was multiple months that it took them to realize that. And of course, the adversary sees this EDR deployment that was taking months to deploy. And my guess is the adversary is probably still in there, right? And just continue to pivot and jog to places they couldn't find. Whereas had you understood the details of the adversary, had you understood their sophistication and their techniques, what you would have done instead is deployed an EDR solution over a weekend to everything so that you could have immediately found all instances and eradicated everything all at once in a rapid fire fashion, and likely had a better chance of eradicating the adversary, right? So there's a really good example of what I think were best intentions, because they weren't properly informed by understanding the after of the campaign and their motivation, probably resulted in a bad result. On the other hand, I've seen similar incidents where, you understand the motivation of an adversary, you understand what their target is, and you might make some radical decisions, for example, to take that particular target offline for a period of time until you get the necessary provisions in place, right? Like, if you know your whole company can keep running, but you've got to maybe disconnect this one production system from the internet and it can run disconnected, then do it, right? Like, if you know that that's what their target is. So, I think having a threat-informed defense is incredibly important. And I don't think this is a question of anyone being wrong in the past. It's just we can do things we couldn't do 2 or 3 years ago. And look, I mean, this is where tools like Searchlight come in, right? I mean, the ability to look through all of the data on the deep and dark web at an incredible level of sophistication to identify what is relevant to my company and then use that to make database decisions. That's the stuff that moves the needle on things like this.
Well, I'm gonna throw out another provocative comment here to Luke. So Luke, I know I'm not going to name the event, but you went to an event recently and they were kind of suggesting that threat intelligence was a nice to have, but maybe not a security priority. But I think what Caleb is describing here is that that's not the case. And I think it comes back actually to what we were talking about right at the beginning. You have to make decisions really quickly. And Caleb just gave 2 brilliant examples of this can really inform your decision making if you understand what the threat is. So yeah, what was it? Was your thought on that event, Luke? I guess, and that kind of approach of threat intelligence being a nice to have.
Yeah. So I think if you class threat intelligence as a nice to have, you're reacting to events. Okay, you need to know what's coming up and how you can prevent that attack, not reacting. There's so many different ways a threat actor could target your organization and exploit you that you're not going to have a game plan for every single event. Therefore, being forewarned is being forearmed. You can prevent that. Now, obviously, a lot of the organizations, there are budget constraints. There are resourcing constraints when it comes to human resources. Okay, so they are considerations which organizations have to consider. Large organizations, they might have threat intelligence teams. They might have dedicated incident response teams. The smaller organizations, they might not have those in place, but you still need that plan and you still need to understand where can you gather this information from. There's a lot of feeds out there, threat intelligence feeds, which can help organizations. I think sharing within the threat intelligence community has increased fairly significantly. I still think there's a lot of sharing which should and could happen. But yeah, ultimately, if you are reacting to a situation, you've lost straight away.
Just to extend on that, though, I think even the smaller teams, they're probably now going to be working with an MSSP that maybe has access to that information when they need it, or are paying someone to monitor this on their behalf. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to recognize that, your typical SIM, your typical security monitor is looking for the known knowns, right? What we're talking about here are the unknown unknowns, right? Where intelligence can inform you of what you don't know and you weren't aware of.
When it comes to outsourcing either threat intelligence or incident response, there are aspects which organizations should consider. Okay, these are going to be your lines of communication. Who should they report into? How does that information get passed backwards and forwards? Okay, because if you've been hit by an attack, potentially your lines of communication have been impacted. So how are they going to communicate? You've got to think about the outsourced organization. Are they up for the job? Do they know enough about your organization as well? These are external to your organization, making sure that they're well informed so they are going down the right path when it comes to incident responsible threat intelligence. So just a couple of bits there to think about when you do outsource, or if you do outsource any of that sort of content.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks, Luke. And I did, I guess, just want to lead to some of this practical advice. So again, I know this is a really difficult thing to do, but Caleb, now when you're talking to organizations, let's stick at the executive level. If someone says to you, what advice will you give me to kind of improve my incident response? I lie awake at night, I worry about this terrible day. What I guess is kind of like a parting note to that listener would you say is maybe 1 or 2 things they should prioritize today?
Well, I think first and foremost is, practice and rehearse, right? There's actually some really interesting brain science behind this as well. When this incident occurs, it is going to be unbelievably stressful to you and your whole team. And, what happens in crisis is that your brain naturally switches into that fight or flight mode, and there's a different part of your brain making decisions. So if we think of, emergency room physicians, firefighters, EMTs, law enforcement, right? The way they get past this is to practice and rehearse over and over and over again so that their decisions are thought out ahead of time and that they're operating off of run books. Now, this isn't just so that you have something cool that's documented for, assessors and auditors. This is actually so that you can think through clearly the decisions you need to make when you're under stress and you're under crisis and your veins are just full of cortisol and adrenaline, right? Because the reality is that's what's going to happen. So practice and rehearsing over and over again to the point at which your response is muscle memory is what makes all the difference. And even when you get hit with something you don't have a run book for, you haven't practiced or rehearsed, because you have imagined incidents that are close enough, you can easily adapt to that. It's, I can't tell you how many times I'll go in on an incident and, you walk into the room and there are other people with the company that are introducing themselves to each other at the very first time. It's the first time the CEOs may be meeting their IR team and the first time everybody's meeting the crisis comms team. That can never happen, because when I see that, I can already tell you how that incident's going to go. It's going to be very slow. There's going to be a lot of internal arguments, and the adversary is going to outpace, your best defense. So getting in there and practicing, having a threat-informed defense, those are the big things I would leave you with that can make a real difference.
And you, Luke, is there anything that you would add on top of that, or?
I'd definitely be in agreement there. I will bring up one additional use case if that's okay, though. Fairly recently, I worked with a global bank. With that global bank, one of their suppliers had been hit by ransomware. The global bank received a notification of their supplier stating that their confidential information wasn't leaked, but because they were a supplier, they were letting them know that they were involved in a breach. Now, that bank, they could have believed that notification. They could have said that, yep, our third party, they're being honest with us, they've been involved in a ransomware attack, and our content isn't out there. But they didn't take that for face value. They engaged myself to go off, identify the ransomware content, review the content which was breached, to see, was their third party being legitimate? Was there anything to do with ours out there on the dark web? When I reviewed the content, okay, so this is, again, part of incident response. When I reviewed that content, I went through it. There was loads of stuff to do with the global banking out there, which could have been used by a threat actor to gain access to their system. There were credentials and all sorts of information. So then, from a reputational damage point of view, that third party who was breached, who was going through their incident response policy, on the outside, it looked really good. They sent off the correct communications. It looked like they had a good, firm grasp as to what was breached. But then you drill into the detail and you realize, actually, there was some gaping holes there in terms of what was actually breached, what information was out there. Again, it's just one of those examples how threat intelligence and incident response can help you, not only for the initial what's going on here, from a reputational damage point of view, and that communication is going out to the end customers.
Yeah, and I think really highlights the thing that we talk about a lot on this is about going to the source, going to the dark web, seeing what you can identify, because that is the most kind of reliable first point of data. Just before we finish up, I can't end this recording without bringing up a TED Talk I watched in preparation for this that you did, Caleb, which was titled, "Where is Cybercrime Really Coming From?" I'm going to put it in the show notes, and I actually really recommend everybody watches it. But as a quick summary, in that TED Talk, you described, firstly, the devastating effects of cyber attacks, very sophisticated kind of banking Trojans, and then you talk about where cybercrime is really coming from, which is actually something you said on this podcast just now, which that mostly it's coming from these organized gangs and not nation states, in spite of what some organizations may claim, maybe to defer regulators for a little while. And you discuss then the dark web, where they hold these operations and talk about a lot of the stuff that we talk about in this podcast. The slightly disturbing thing was that this TED Talk is from November 2016, so 8 years ago now. And I honestly think you could probably release it today and get away with that.
I think the funny thing is it's almost comical because it was kind of one of the, it wasn't the first TED Talk on cybersecurity, but it's one of the very early ones. So it's almost comical to listen to and a little bit frustrating because not a lot's changed. There are some interesting points in there, like this is pre-pandemic, and I talk about the great response you'd see from countries over a pandemic. Not so much. So you can get a good laugh out of that. But, here's the fundamental crux of all that, right? The vast majority of cybercrime or cybersecurity incidents comes from organized crime. That's a fact. That can ultimately be mitigated. And the way to mitigate that is to stop paying ransoms. You have to change the economics for the bad guys. Now, that's a very difficult thing to propose, but I think that premise still exists out there that a lot of this can go away. We just have to be willing to stop paying for it, because if the venture capital goes away, then so do the attacks. Unfortunately, to do that, a couple of companies that got impacted would probably have to fold. But I would argue, as I did back in 2016, that might be a worthwhile price to pay, because this is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. Some statistics now have this over $1 trillion a year. It's easily over in the several $100 billion a year. To put this in perspective, that's bigger than the GDP of most European nations. And again, that's just the crime side of this. So, I think that might be a worthwhile listen if you want a little bit of a laugh. But the bigger point is, we haven't moved the needle on that at all. If anything, things have gotten worse since that TED Talk.
Caleb, can I ask you a question based off that TED Talk? During the TED Talk,
Sure.
You mentioned about the importance of sharing information. Do you think, since that TED Talk took place, that the sharing of information, threat intelligence information to do with incidents, has increased, decreased?
I actually think that's probably the one real win. Threat intel sharing is exceptional right now. The reality is, if you develop a unique, let's say, variant of malware, once that is detected, and that kind of falls in the dragnet of, one of the larger companies, that is in everybody's hands now in a matter of minutes. We're not talking 30 minutes, 40 minutes, couple of hours. When I did that TED Talk, it was days. This is now something that's probably sub 5 minutes. That's exceptional. Because what it means is the minute these things are detected, that campaign is useless, or at least that variant of that campaign is useless. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is we've automated the hell out of this, and there's not a lot of human beings involved. And I think we need to look no further than the updates from CrowdStrike to realize that when that goes wrong, it goes wrong on a very big scale. So the good news here is we're all sharing threat intel. The tough thing is now we need to figure out how to do that with a very high efficacy without ever causing a problem like what we saw in the case of the CrowdStrike updates.
You've very much covered off where I was going with that, Caleb. Strike stuff.
Well, look at their response. So first of all, George and the team there did an amazing job at being transparent, right? But when you read through their, kind of final lessons learned, the part that I don't think they come out and say outright is you can't do this without it being automated. There is no way to do what they do if a human being has to approve it, because it can't happen fast enough and the volume's too high. So if that's the case, and if you're literally doing things that can mess with the kernel, there's always going to be a risk there. And I think this moves from a situation where, so first of all, we need to accept that risk, and I think the industry has. But there probably are some ways we can mitigate it, both on the CrowdStrike side as well as at every company, right? Do you want to have a completely homogeneous answer for everything that you do? Maybe not coming out of that. And look, I'm not trying to get into the litigation side of this, but I think depending on where this Delta lawsuit goes, the discovery of that could be fascinating. Not so much from a who's to blame and all that, but how dependent have some companies become on a single vendor literally having the ability to take down everything? And maybe we need to think about that in new ways.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting point. One thing that I also, just going back to the TED Talk, that I also think is a slight difference now, and actually we talked about it again earlier in the podcast, is that in the TED Talk you do say we're never going to know who these actors are who are attacking you.
Oh yeah, that's totally changed.
And they're definitely not going to be.
Oh, you definitely know who they are.
Yeah, And that's, I think, I mean, just to try and end on a positive note, I think especially in the last year, we have seen a shift in that in terms of, people like the guy behind Lockbit being identified and maybe not quite being brought to justice yet, but certainly with very little room to maneuver, I would say, from a law enforcement perspective. He's never traveling to the States. Let's put it that way.
he's never going on vacation again. Well, I think that's a good example where governments get involved to help. I think the other reality is, talking with people that do ransomware negotiations all day, they literally know who's on the other end. Based on the response they get and the phrasing, everything else. Oh, it's Bob again, and I mean, this is a business. It might be an illegitimate business, but it's a business like everything else. There's reputations. You know who's on the other end. You know what they're going to do. You know whether you can negotiate with them. So think about how informative that is. You've just been locked up with ransomware, and the person that is negotiating that, whether they're with Palo Alto or Arete or Coveware, they probably know who's on the other end, and they can inform you and go, hey, we know this guy. Here's what's going to happen next. And if you pay him, they're going to do X and Y and Z, right? Again, that's threat intelligence. That is incredibly informative as to what you want to do next. Well,
going back to the OODA loop example, who's in the other plane. Where they were trained and exactly. Their tactics. It changes.
And hey, this guy's going to settle for $100,000. So let's throw that out there. Or look, if you don't pay this guy, here's what he's going to be coming back after, and either, harden your defenses or get ready to write a big check.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both for joining me. I think that's a good note to draw a line under this episode of The Dark Dive. If you have a topic you'd like us to discuss on the podcast, please feel free to get in touch through the email address or the social media accounts in the show notes. And if you can't wait to find out more, remember you can always follow us for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever podcast app you use, and get all of the episodes of The Dark Dive as soon as they're released. Until next time, stay safe.